Yeah, the microphone's not working. Right. Test? Yeah.
All right, if everyone's all set, we'll kick off the second talk.
Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Matthias Nivella. I'm here to talk about forms and validations, namely asynchronous validations and ngModel options and some other cool features that you can do with 1.3. So, who am I? Well, I've been a web developer for about 10 years. I've done full stack stuff, pretty much anything on a website, even the server, the hosting, the design, all that stuff. And in the past 2 years, I've kind of gotten acquainted with AngularJS. So I'm from Toronto. I was born in Finland, and I have a degree in computer science. But for the past 2 years, I've been focusing on Angular. And at the time, there was really nothing out there. There was any articles or guides that kind of taught it. And that kind of motivated me to blog about it and to kind of teach other people so I can learn it really well myself. And then about half a year into blogging, I wanted to work on the framework because there's a lot of missing features in the framework, right? That like stuff that I wanted, like animations and like cool form validations. And that led me to work full time on the framework because I showed a lot of interest into it. And so other things, Jurgen was my blog where I talk about a lot about Angular stuff. It's all the little cloud logos on here. And on a weekly basis, I'll code in a variety of programming languages, including JavaScript, Dart, Clojure, and so on. Okay, so forms. So who here in the audience, has written forms, has done a lot of form work with Angular? Assuming a lot of people here, right? Yeah. Okay, who here has no clue at all how the forms work? There's got to be at least one person here. Yes. Okay, that means I can do a demo on this. Okay. So the way that this talk is going to work is I'm just going to slowly build a demo of all these new features. It's not going to be that much coding, but slowly build it from step by step. And then you'll see the complications that come up, and you can see how these new features can really help out. Okay, so what are the basics of a form? Well, Angular just uses regular form code to make a form. It doesn't have these complicated JavaScript structures that create bindings and all that stuff. It's just HTML code, and then the forms, and Angular sort of picks up on the forms. And the major significance of forms in Angular is to record data into models, and you use a property called ngModel to do that. And then you use validity state, not on the model, but on the name of the input element and the name of the form, and that's placed on the scope. And then, ideally, you want to have a controller that all it does is it determines what goes into the form, it determines when the form gets submitted based on the validity of the form. And the best way to do that is to disassociate from the HTML code. So let's see an example of this now. Here I have an empty index HTML file. Is the font size okay for everybody? Okay, perfect. So there's some dependencies for like styling this nicely, and then we have Angular animate, and something called Angular messages, which we'll get to in a moment. But we have an empty file, right? Okay, so let's create a form. Okay, so we just have a basic field that when you type in values into this field, it's going to record it on a name property, which is going to sit on the scope, right? So if I come here and enter a value, you can see the value shows up adjacent to the field, our basic stuff, ngModel. Saves you tons of JavaScript code if you were to do this otherwise, right? Okay, so let's add some validations to this then. So I'm just going to add some extra code right here. Since I've styled this nicely, add a label. And I'm going to add a name property, just like a regular HTML name. I'm going to call this first name, right? And I'm going to change this model thing to be called form.firstName. And let's add first name here just to see that it works. And so far, if I type in Matthias, it's not working because I need to have form.firstName. So Matthias, you can see that it shows up below, right? Okay, we still got a basic form. That's great. But how can we validate this to see that it works? Well, we can add a validator using ngIf, and we have to find the model property of the form. Yes? That better? Oh, okay, I see. I see. Okay, so we're gonna make this a little bit smaller, but let's keep it in the center of the screen. We're gonna have a validation that's gonna show up for based on this model property, right? So we're gonna say my form dot first name dot error dot required, right? So this error is gonna show up when the field is not entered, so that you must enter your first name, right? So you see how the error is right there, right away? You know, you haven't even done anything wrong, and the error is showing up. These are the complications that Angular kind of brings up, right? And you know, I feel like I haven't done anything. My mother blames me for something I've already done. You know, and I have to sit in my room and just cry or whatever, right? This is what I feel like. So you can tell that it works, so it's enter a value. But we need to have the validators kind of validate the code at the right moment. So the user experience needs to be better. And let's explore some of these methods using ngModel options. Now, I could do one thing. I could add this other property, which says, if the error is there, and myForm.firstName.touched, which means that you've actually focused on the field and focused out. Then when I go back, you can see because the touch value is there in the first place. That's one trick. Another trick is to set a submitted flag. So let's remove that. And when the form gets submitted using ngSubmit, I can say submitted equals true. But I have to pass in no validate, so the native browser validations won't kick in. So I press enter, and the error shows up, right? Okay, that's coming along pretty nicely. What's one way we can control that the Angular code won't kind of take over when the validation is invalid? What we can do is, in addition to the submit true, we can say controller.submit, and we can say ngController equals form controller as CTRL. And then down here, we can say form controller, and then here we would have this.submit. We get the form data, and we get the validity. I think that's right. And let's say that we have if validity alert submitting JSON string file. So we're going to send that data. And when we call submit, we want to pass in, see if we have form dot, we want to pass in the form, and we want to pass in the myForm.valid, which would mean that when we submit it, is it valid or not? Okay, so I try to submit, nothing happens, and then I submit, and that's what gets sent to the server, basic validation. And this is what Angular does really well, but the UI portion with older versions of Angular is kind of tricky, and these new features are going to make it really nice. Okay, so we placed some validations, we showed some errors, and we did something after the submission. Okay. So what are some of the challenges that I've already talked about, but other challenges that may come up? So these validations are too fast, as I pointed out earlier. There are such things called parsers and formatters, which are used to make your own validators, but that sort of API is a little bit old school and kind of tricky to play around with. And how would you go about making an asynchronous validator? Like something that would go to a server, check if a username exists, and then show an error message depending on the status. And then if you look at the HTML code that I was creating, like look at this, like this dot this dot this, and then this, it's just this terse HTML code that we can't reuse easily. And yeah, someone else is going to look at that and just, they're going to destroy it in one way or another. Yeah, it's too much. And then if I wanted to make forms that repeat, and dynamic forms, which are adding properties one by one, how could I do that? Okay, well, let's take a look at the first issue then. rapid-fire validators. Now, should we place the control in the template, something like ngIf submitted or ngIf touched, or should we have CSS determine when we display the errors? Those are two ways that you can do it. Another way is to use something called ngModel options. Now, this is a 1.3 feature. It's really only been around for a few weeks. And it's one of those APIs that's constantly changing, like you're just trying to find the best API for it. So once 1.3 is released, you'll see a stable API. However, if you want to use it right away, you can get the latest 1.3. Look at the documentation and see how it works. So the main point of ngModel options is to kind of control when the data in the model is updated from the input field to the model. The template itself then acts as normal, so you won't have any other dependency except for the input field. So what I mean by dependency is this waiting for something to be updated, depending on the state of that? No, as soon as the model updates, then this updates. But you can control when the model updates. So let's see an example of that. All right, so we were having issues with this first name submission, right? So let's keep the submitted property, right? But if we have value, so hold on. We press enter, you can see that we enter the value, but if I type in a value, you can see the value updates immediately, right? In some context, that might not be usable. So if you pass in ngModel options, and we pass in update on, and we type in blur, this will only update on blur. So if I type in a value, you can see that the error is still there. As soon as I blur, it goes away. So this ngModel options controls exactly when the model updates. So now, this is a really nice use case for this. It's controlling asynchronous validators or controlling excess HTTP calls. So I'm sure everyone's had a sort of similar circumstance where you have a website that has a search field, and you enter data into the search field. The URL updates, and then the second it updates, it searches the database, right? But if you type in too fast, you might get dozens of HTTP requests that happen one after the other, right? And you can think about the server, that poor server that's trying to reply to all of those HTTP requests, right? And the solution is to have a timeout that would wait 500 milliseconds and then check to see if there was any other value that was entered when it was run, right? But having to do this all the time with your JS code is just too much JS code in your controller, and just you can make your own directive, but it's kind of a messy situation, right? So let's see an example of this one. So here I have a sort of bit.ly style application where I can add a URL and it creates like this shortened version of that URL. And we have a search field. And now the search field doesn't actually search a database, it just does a local search of what are the properties in the page using a filter. But I sort of hacked it so that if I were to type in a value here, like we type in Google, you can see that we had GO, all that stuff. So we have 6 different HTTP requests to the server, right? And your code might still function because it's going to read the last HTTP request, but this is unnecessarily complex. Just too much stuff going into the server and too much stuff getting checked and so on, right? If we use ngModel options, how can we make that better? So let's see. So here we have the search input field. If I pass in ngModel options, and I put debounce, and in here, I say default, and I put in 500 milliseconds. What should happen is, did I screw up somehow? Yes. Okay, so if I type in Google, only one, because the debounce kind of grouped all of those edits together into just one edit, and the last one was put together. That's what it did. However, I can keep typing stuff, and then it searches, but you can also, I guess because Google was a value from before, so Google X, yeah, okay. If I wanted to make it so that if I type, there's a delay, but if I blur out of it, there isn't, I can simply type in blur, 0. So I typed Google, and immediately it did the search based off of the model event. Okay, so that's fairly cool. So before we hop into the next section, everyone understands the ngModel features are pretty cool. And I feel like with the API, sort of new stuff that's coming into the API, like being able to customize setters and getters and determining, instead of having just a simple model property, you can have it call function as it updates. You can have really complex form code with a really simple API, very clean HTML code. Okay, so let's go to the next section then. So, has anyone had any experience creating a validator in Angular? Right? You used parsers or formatters, put it into that array, right? Okay, so let's talk about that. The way that works is create a directive, my validator, you attach it onto the input element, and then within the directive code, you require the ngModel controller, you just do require ngModel, and then you get ngModel.parser.formatter, and then you add in a validator in between. And there's nothing entirely wrong with this, it's just that the order of the properties in the validator for the parser, the formatter, is kind of fixed, The require has to happen first. Then your validator can happen, then this validator can happen. But that's kind of prone to failure. And if you think about it, it's kind of like a series of Christmas lights, where one Christmas light kind of blanks out, and then they all go. This is the old stuff from back in the day, not the new ones where like one of them screws up, and they still function. But like the old ones where one light like explodes or whatever, and then none of them work. Right? It's kind of the same metaphor that I have for parsers and formatters. Okay, so what are our options? Well, right now, in 1.3 master, and like beta 12 and plus or something, there's $validators pipeline, and in there you can add in a validator directly. So you get a hold of the ngModel, and then you do $validators, and then you add it in there. And synchronous validations, like checking to see how long a field is, checking the pattern, checking some sort of local property is easy. You just return a Boolean, and that will determine the validity of that validator. Or you can return a promise. Now the promise code is still like very bleeding edge, and I'll show that in a second. Okay, so a synchronous validator. For example, password requirements. It needs to be alphanumeric. It needs to have numbers. It needs to have a period. It needs to have all these other complex constraints because passwords need to be super, super complicated lately. Thanks to the Heartbleed bug, I gotta think of all new passwords for all of my logins on dozens of websites. But anyways, yes, you need to return a Boolean, right? The code looks like this. We've gotten a hold of the ngModel controller, and that came over here as model, and then directed. And then here we're doing validators, we're doing username pattern, for example. And we're returning the output of a regular expression test, which is a Boolean value. And when we run the validator, so username pattern validator, that is run each time the model value changes, and it's going to test that. Okay, that's cool. But what about asynchronous validators? What happens if you want to check to see if a username exists on a server somewhere? And we have to do a round trip access to a server, we have to wait, we have to show a loading indicator, and then we have to update the model and prevent the form from submitting at the same time. Well, this is a brand new feature. It's only it's not in master yet, due to a small API complication, but within August it will be. And the idea here is that if you return a promise, both the $valid and $invalid properties on the input element and the form are going to be set to undefined. Because if you think about it, if valid is false and it's undefined, it's still considered false, right? But when a asynchronous operation is going on, the validity of the form is undefined. You don't know what it is until the response comes in. Here's what the code looks like. So our username pattern is going to go to an API and check to see if the username exists. It's going to return a promise. Okay, well let's see an example of this. So in the same code right here, I'm going to add in postal code validator. There we go. So we have postal code validator, and we're going to check the Canadian postal code, right? Canadian postal codes are kind of unique. I haven't seen any other country that has as a mix of alphanumeric characters. So I find this is always a good exercise to test on. Testing a US postal code is just numbers, right? So it's a fairly easy validator. Okay, so we have our postal code validator. And we have this regular expression which matches a postal code. This is our synchronous code validator. Let's add in the HTML code from the example before. Okay. So we have a postal code now. It's already telling us that we didn't enter a valid postal code, right? We could go ahead and add ngModel options to this, but I'm sure that everyone understands how that works. But okay, so if I enter a postal code now, if I type in M5J2S2, okay, something going on with this. I think I forgot to close. Yeah, there we go. So I type in my postal code, M5J2S2. The error's gone right away. Perfect. Very nice. But we should do the next step and connect to a postal code API and check to see if that postal code is actually valid. Because the validator is kind of useless if it's just checking, number, letter, space, number, letter. Okay, so we want to check that. So we have this other validator called postal code availability. And in here, I have a local host server that will just return true or false. I mean, it will return HTTP 200 or HTTP 400, depending on whether or not that postal code is valid. And right now, I have to actually check to see if the previous validator passed, and then I'm going to check. This is the reason why the API is getting redesigned, and I'll get to this in a minute. But the main point here is that we are checking HTTP localhost 3050 and so on, right? Okay, so let's add the code for that. And let's also add a loading indicator that tells us whether the response is complete or not, right? And then I'm going to add a nice, fancy, what do I call this thing? Loading icon. Okay, so it's M5J2S2. Checking the postal code, is it going to pass? No, I did not enter a valid postal code. Now, I'm going to actually enter it, because if I look at the code for my postal code database, let's install HTTP server. It's just checking my old friend's postal code. Everything else is invalid. So let's enter that value. Checking. Okay, it's valid. But if I were to try to submit the form at the time it's trying to submit this, if I type in input type submit, and we're going to change the model, so it's on the form, so form.postal code. And did I miss anything? So if I try to submit now, it doesn't work, right? I type in my name. And then I enter a postal code. I can't submit. It's not letting me submit until the asynchronous code is done, and then I can submit. But for some reason, it only collected my name. Not sure why I only collected my name, but once this is in master, it could be a potential bug, but this is the new API that's going to be for asynchronous code validation. Okay, cool. So this is kind of the idea that we had in mind for the new one, because what we've kind of detected with validators is that it's very hard to bunch them all together, like asynchronous validators, synchronous code, and then native validators, like checking to see if a field is required and it passes that validity. So we're just going to have a new validator system. We just do model.addValidator, and then you pass in the name, and then you pass in the function. And then for an asynchronous one, you just have an async tree. And that's how that works. And then that will clear a lot of the problems we have with ngModel. Good. Better API. Huh? Okay. Cool. All right. So next thing, what are some of the problems with displaying errors on screen? So as I mentioned before, it's just way too much HTML code. It's this underusable mush of HTML code that I can't copy and paste from one app to another, or copy and paste from one view to another. So how can I improve that? Well, here's an example of an old school system. We've been using this so far in the example code. If we look at the postal code, we have this, my form, my field, error, postal code. And this works great if you have like one error on the page. But when you have multiple errors, that's when you have to do stuff like this. Is this field valid? Is this field not there? And it's interesting because the more fields you have, the more Boolean values you have to compare, and it turns to mush, right? So, ngMessages, which is a part of 1.3 already, released in an earlier beta version. So if you download the latest beta, you'll see this file called AngularMessages. What you can do is you can listen on model error, and then you can display multiple error messages very easily. What does it look like? So here we have name, username, right? And then we have the my form from before, and we're using username $error. And then these are all the errors that could potentially show up for the username validation. We set a min length of 5. We set a username pattern. We set a username availability. So that's also the asynchronous code and the synchronous code for pattern and min. But what does this mean? The whole idea is how it presents the information. We care that the min length is displayed first. Because if you're entering a value and it's invalid, would you rather be told that it's too short first and then it's invalid? Other than it's too short, it's invalid, and it's taken, and I don't like the username or something like that. It's just too much error, too many errors are displayed. So what ngMessages does is it shows the error that has the higher priority first, and if that error is present on the model. So let's go back to our code. For this first name field, I type in div ngMessages, and I'm listening on my form dot first $error. And I'm going to show div ngMessage, and I'm going to say required. You did not enter your name. And then I'm going to show another one for min length. Because supposedly first names have a minimum length. Your first name is too short. Okay. I'm going to remove the previous error. And let's get rid of the ngModel options for now. And let's add a min length of 2 or 3. So does anyone have a first name here that is 2 letters long? Okay. But names like Ted and Matt and stuff like that are okay. So 3 letters is the bare minimum. Oh? Oh, okay. It has to be 2 letters. So, it's not working right now because I didn't include ngMessages into my module. You can see that it's down here as AngularMessages. So I need to add in this extra module, ngMessages. Now my name's an entry, but if I type in one letter, hey, the name's too short, and I type another one, it's fine. So this solved that whole complexity of one error showing up before the other. And then you can say if it's too long. My name is 6 letters long, so I'm going to say 7. This is the absolute max. And now when I enter a name, if I say like Sir Matthias, I can enter it because it's max length. But if I type in ng, so like think about a Twitter tweet, right? If you go beyond the 200 characters, you're still going to be able to type, but it's going to tell you that you've gone too far. So these native HTML validators are really strict. They cut off the amount of text that you can type. So if I put in ng, max length, this will still handle the validation the same way, but I can type in more. So if I type in Sir Matthias, it's too long. And then the error goes, and then I can't submit the code because it's invalid, right? But if I just put Matthias, probably, well, I gotta figure out the postal code, but same idea. Okay, so ngMessages gets really cool when you have multiple input fields. So let's say that I had the same stuff for a last name. Okay, so we have a duplicate code pretty much here that will check first name and last name, right? How can I reuse this code? How can I take the errors that I wrote for my first name and apply them to both the first name and the last name? Well, what I can do is I can create a inline template. I do script type text ng template. I give us an idea of errors.html. And in here, I take these errors. And let's say we generalize them. We say that your value is too short. Right now, you did not enter a value. Your value is too short. Your value is too long. Okay, so we have this sort of reusable template for our errors. In here, I can just say ng messages include errors.html. Is it plural or is it singular? Yeah, it's plural. And the same goes for this. You can see that the errors get applied to both fields. It's nice and reusable. But it looks like a robot put this together because it's like your value is too short, your value is too long. There's no actual, I feel like there's no consideration put into this form. How can I make it so that I can still have reusability but still override particular messages for specific fields? You know, I could be entering a number field and it could be too short, but maybe the number isn't too high or too low or something like that. So if you can focus on specific errors for specific input fields while including all the other general errors, then you would have a pretty nice API. So what we can do is, let's say we copy mid-length and type in, your name is too short. It must be n. Let's add this 3 characters. So you see if I say you did not enter a value, you type in a value, the value is too short, but I said this, must be n. So the min-length validator overrode the previously defined error message in the remote reusable template. This is how ngMessages works. So we saw how to use this. Okay, so let's hop into this last section then. How can we make forms that are repeatable and expandable? Just by having a button that you click and it adds more form instances into our code. So this is something that's still quite debated in Angular, like what's the one true way to do this. But for now, the way that works the best is to have nested ng form instances. And an ng form instance is the same thing as the form tag. It's just a directive it's the same directive, it's just a different. One's an attribute, one's an element. So let's see an example. For our first name, last name, postal code example, let's have an email input that you can invite your friends, but you can add more and more friends. So let's get rid of our postal. Well, I'm not going to get rid of the postal code, but add it in between here. So let's say invite friends. All right. So what we want is we want to have a div ng repeat. We want to have friend in friends. And then we're going to have something that says aref ng click invite friend. But this won't work because I don't have invite friend defined, and I don't want to add this to my controller. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have, actually, you know what, I'm going to add this to the controller. It's a better idea. So in my controller, I'm going to add this.inviteFriend equals function scope.form Okay, so scope.form equals that. We'll invite friend, we'll do the scope.form. Scope.form.friends.push, and we're going to put an empty object. So we're going to have, what did I call it? Form. Controller. Okay. We're going to do the index. So if I type in it, where's the button? Oh. So if I type friend, is that working? That's not. Oh. Where's my code now? This is bound to happen with live coding. Don't tell anybody I'm using alert statements to debug my app. Okay, so that's working. If I want to debug this, what I can do is I can right-click on here, and if I type in $0, I have the element. I can say angular.element $0.scope, and I can type in form, and we get friends. Okay, so it's adding into the list, so maybe my repeater code is incorrect. Sorry? Something says? Oh. Like this or the other one? Or? On the controller is spelled wrong. Sorry? Oh, that's right. Thank you. No. Oh, okay. I'm gonna look at a pre-made example of this because this is not working. Oops. Okay. So here we have an example. This is something I use as a backup, right? So I use like the Julia Child method where you try to cook something on the show, and if it doesn't work, you take one fresh thing out of the oven. And you have it. All right, so here we have a reminder, right? If you add a reminder, you can add these input elements, right? And this is, I got the idea from the Google Calendar invite thing. You can have reminders for when the calendar date occurs. So how am I coding this? Well, basically, here we have a field set, which is another container for all the new form fields we're putting in there. But our repeater, which is right here, is we have a reminders form and we have entries. So we just have an array of some sort, and then we're adding in values into that array. And the key to doing this is that you have, for each instance of the repeater, you have an ng form, and we're going to give it a name of reminder. So we have nested forms, not like actual HTML nested forms, but one nested form, like multiple nested forms inside of a parent form. And to make this work, we're just going to do all the code within that as a regular form. So we have, both entry. So we have like entry.scale, which is the scale, like if your reminder is going to be set on minutes or days or hours. And then we have entry.value. But you notice how the name, so we have name value, and then we have name scale. But to actually access the errors, so this ng messages thing, and simply doing the errors for the entire form. So this is the errors for both the scale and both the value. So when both of those are missing, you can determine the errors based off that. So if I type in, if I try to submit this right now, it says both fields, right? You enter both fields. So if I say 10 minutes, you can see that the validation is based off both of those. So you can put ng messages on top of the form, or you can put it on top of individual elements. So there's not really too much code I can show you here, but the key to doing this is you repeat the ngForm instance. And then you access the validation properties of that, and then the actual ngModel is going to go to the thing that you're repeating. If you're repeating an array, you're just going to add values to the array. So when this gets submitted, you're going to have an entries array on your data, and that's going to contain all the data from those input fields that you've been repeating. We didn't have to use any messy curly brackets with like index +1 or any of that stuff to make this work. All we did was just entry repeat with ngForm. But that is the end of my presentation. This guy a little bit longer. It was great being here. Thank you, everybody. These meetups are wonderful. Any questions? So the question is, for the validators pipeline, I was adding something to the ngModel.validators.something. What was the value dot something? That's the name of the validator. So username pattern is the validator. And that will show up in $error when it's invalid. So it's $error dot username pattern when it fails. Any other questions?
$0. Is there anything else that's like that? That was really cool. I didn't know that existed.
Okay, so yeah, if I click on this, whatever item that you selected in the inspector is going to be $0, and then when you select another item, that's going to be $0, but the previous one is going to be $1. So it's this queue of items that you selected in the inspector. And aside from that, I don't think there's really much. That little $0 trick is just so I can get into Angular, right? So if I wanted to see, Angular element, $0, and I want to get the injector, and then I wanted to get the HTTP service, I could get that. So you can just kind of debug in there. Where this is very useful is when you're doing protractor testing and you want to see what's going on with your app and why it's failing. You can pause protractor by using browser.debugger, and then with the Chrome instance that's running in the background, you hop in there and you just start playing around with the command line. Any other questions? Cool. All right. Yes, one more. So format a value in an input field, so it's different from the model value? Can you say it a little bit louder, sorry? Yes. So what you do, so the idea with that is exactly what you said. It's called formatting. And his question was that if I have a currency value, and in the input field I want to display it with some precision with like 5.00 or some extra formatting, but the actual data that's submitted to the server is like a more raw value. And a good example of that is like a date input field. What you're submitting into the scope is the actual instance of new dates, like a JavaScript date object. However, what shows up on screen could very well be split between multiple input boxes. It could be the month, the day, the year. So how do we do that? I'm not going to show a full example of that, but basically, the idea is that you get a hold of the ngModel with the directive, and then in here you can say ctrl.formatters.push with a value. Since this is on a directive, this will only apply to the input element that you assign it to, and then in here you can do value equals $0 value or whatever, right? Some sort of formatting thing. And since it's a formatter, that's what's going to show up on the input elements, not on the model. A parser is the opposite way around, where it's going to take whatever you type in there and it's going to morph it into some other value that's going to be available on the scope when you submit the form. That's how you do that. Okay, that's it for questions. Thank you, everybody. Pardon me?
Okay. Well, we have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/wrangle.io, and I'm editing them, so they'll be split screen, like half Matthias talking and then half of the screen recording we got. It's just we're delayed to put them up, but we will have them up there.
Right,
Yeah.
and then on the YouTube video, I have all the code that I did here with the form and all the other stuff. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks.